So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on education and the coronavirus and how to think about organizing for reopening. This webinar is hosted by McKinsey's education practice, and we serve clients around the world on early childhood education, school systems, vocational and higher education, and we're supporting clients in many countries right now on their response to the coronavirus. This is our 5th webinar on the education system response, and it will be focused on the organization and governance needed to move into a phase of reopening schools. My name is Emma Dawn. I am McKinsey's Global Education Practice Manager, and I will be moderating today. Let me introduce you to the rest of our team. Frédéric Fournier is a partner from the Brussels office. Stephen Hall is an associate partner from our Dubai office. And we also have our team on the phone today, Omer, Inam, and Rita Al-Kadiri, who helped to pull these materials together. So with that said, let's get started. So countries around the world are in different stages of closing and reopening schools. At its peak, the coronavirus school shutdowns were affecting 1.6 billion children, but some schools have begun to reopen. And now I think we're at about 1.2 billion children who are still out of school. And those school systems now are trying to think about when and how they go about the reopening process. So some of the schools that have recently reopened, several in Europe, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, France, Germany, as well as some in other parts of the world. So as schools begin to think about going back, all of the different stakeholders involved are going to confront a very new reality. Parents are going to be understandably anxious about sending their children back to school. Recent surveys in the United States suggested that 60 to 70% of parents were not comfortable sending their children back until they were certain that schools were going to be completely safe. Similar polls have been taken actually in some of the countries that did go back. In Israel, a poll was taken a couple of weeks before students returned, and 60% of students there, 60% of parents there said they weren't sure whether they were going to send their kids back. 35% said they probably wouldn't of that number. So this could result in lower attendance until parents really feel comfortable that their children are going to be safe. Teachers also, frankly, are very concerned and understandably about their safety in the classroom, especially teachers who are older or who have immune conditions. And teachers are also going to face very different workloads and very different working styles and very different working environments when they return, partly because of the health and safety requirements of being back in the classroom, and partly because learning gaps are going to be wider. Recent NWEA report suggested that as students come back in the fall in the United States, for example, they may have lost up to 50% of the math instruction that they had gained in the previous year. And so with this extended summer slide, students are going to be, some students are going to be particularly behind, and other students are going to be on track, which is going to give teachers a new challenge. There's also going to be a whole host of other decisions that systems need to make, and a whole host of different costs that they're going to need to incur in order to get infrastructure such as transportation and catering safeguarded and ready for return. And all of this is likely to be in a context where budgets will be tighter as tax revenues are impacted by the recession that is accompanying this virus. And so this is going to look very different in different schools. There is going to be a huge variety around the world of different financial situations, of different learning situations, and of different epidemiological situations. That said, there's going to be some commonalities across in terms of having to put in place safeguards to enable schools to operate in a safe way. And these might include things like shift schooling, partial schooling, blended learning during reopening, new public health measures, and this continual preparation for resurgence as the virus is contained and then resurges. And so this all creates a huge challenge for school systems. So just a quick recap before we go into the meat of today's presentation. Our previous presentation focused on the when, the for whom, and the how do you go about reopening. We looked then a little bit at how to think about making the decision on sequencing, reopening schools versus other parts of the economy, bearing in mind the public health risk, the economic imperative of getting schools running so that parents could go back to work, the schooling imperative of getting students back in the classroom to avoid learning loss, and the need to put in health and safety measures. We took a little bit of a look then on for whom do you reopen, whether you do it first for certain grade levels or for certain segments of vulnerable students. And we looked then also at how do you actually go about doing that? What are the health and safety measures that you need to put in place for your schools? But then once you've reopened, school isn't much use if you don't have students in the classroom. So how do you re-enroll students, both those who are nervous of returning, but also those who have dropped out to participate in the economy? And this is an especial problem for girls in the developing world and for high-risk students in the developed. And then how do you remediate the lost learning and plan for resurgence? So if you want to receive that deck, please also ping my assistant, Nancy Flores. Her email will be coming out to you. But today we're going to be focused much more on the organization and governance structures required to make the myriad of decisions that school systems are going to have to make. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague.
Thanks, Emma. So as we've been, over the past few weeks, having conversations with different organizations, whether in schools or in regulators and ministries, there have been a lot of questions that have been coming up as we move towards thinking about reopening. And not necessarily thinking about when to do it or how to do it safely, but actually specifically on this question of how do I organize this? So how do I get this done logistically? How do I make sure that we do this in a way which is as efficient as possible? How do we bring all these different pieces together? The overall organizational challenge of doing this can feel a little bit overwhelming. And so I think this is something which is common across every layer of the system that we've been talking to, and it's common across every system where we're engaged across the world in different capacities. So what we wanted to do today was really to organize this document around the different capabilities that systems need to have in place, what some of that can look like, what some examples are that we're seeing emerging, whether from this crisis or previous crises, and then hopefully have a discussion about how that's playing out in your specific context at the end. So if we go to the next page, the COVID is not in terms of crisis management, actually looks like many other crises. And we know when we see organizations, whether it's school systems, other public sector organizations, private sector organizations, facing a crisis management challenge, there are a number of very common issues that arise, whether it's actually having insufficient data on what's really happening, whether it's about trying to stick to a solution that we know and feels familiar and get back there as soon as we can, speed of making decisions or making poor decisions, and then finally, even if we have the best plan, how do we deliver given the time constraint and the resource constraint? And COVID fits all of those archetypes incredibly well. So this virus has unfolded in a space of days, weeks, months, faster than most organizations, even the most agile, have been able to respond. And so everybody's been playing catch-up. It's new. There's no real learning from best practice because every system around the world is dealing with it with maybe a week or two's time lag to learn from what others have done. It's complex. This is not something which is affecting only one sector. It actually requires multiple different stakeholders to be engaged before we can make any decisions. And finally, the situation is evolving daily. And so coordination is really important at a time when whole organizations have had to shift to remote working and making coordination even more challenging. And so I think that this is in the context of saying there are things that we can learn from how organizations deal with crises in different situations. And so if we go to the next page, this is a little bit the different dimensions of the organizational capability for response that we've been thinking about and putting together with different organizations. So I'd start with the having the bottom half of this chart. So we need, first of all, the ability to make clear decisions, and those decisions will include things like when do we go back, how do we go back, who goes back, but also include things like what gets taught, how do we think about remediation, what kind of measures do we need to take about re-enrolling students. To do that, we need the right data. So we need effective data and monitoring systems, not just the things that school systems typically track, but actually whole new types of data that we haven't historically tracked will become really, really important to get in place fast. Clear communication, both with other stakeholders in government, but then also really importantly with parents, with children, with institutions, with teachers and head teachers. Doing that often, transparently and clearly is even more important than it is in ordinary times. This is going to require partnerships. So whether that's partnerships with people like your school transport operators or the people who come in and run the catering, or whether it's, the single most important partnership at the moment is probably with the Ministry of Health or Department of Health or equivalent. All of our support functions will need to be stepped up in order to make this work, whether it's procurement, whether it's finance, whether it's just the general facilities management of schools, new requirements in terms of cleaning. So everything which ordinarily feels like it is a supporting or incidental component of the education mission is going to become absolutely vital to making this whole thing happen. And finally, what happens at the center, or what happens from a decision-making standpoint, is going to be to put in place protocols and safeguards. The only way that we can do this safely and effectively is if we have a way of ensuring compliance with those guardrails that are put in place. And what ties all of that together in terms of those capabilities is the existing organization that we see in school systems does not have the immediate capacity to be able to do all of this right now. And so at each level, whether it's at the national level, the regional level, even potentially at the school level, we need to find new ways that we're supporting leaders to make good decisions and implement things effectively in the coming weeks and months. So I'm going to talk first of all then about this question of decision making and the nature of support that different organizations need. Now, different school systems are organized very differently. So in some countries it's very centralized, in other places it can be very decentralized, whether to the regional level or even to the school level. But you can generally think about these archetypes. You have the central administration at a national level or at a state level, which is setting the guidelines and the standards. You have the school level, which has greater or lesser autonomy depending on the system. And then you can have one or more middle layers that help with the management and governance across different areas of those components. If we go to the next page, you can see that different countries in their COVID response have responded differently in terms of the roles of those different organizations, either from having a very, very centralized approach of having a national level task force and setting very, very clear guardrails that apply across the whole country, all the way across to Vietnam and China, where actually provincial, municipal authorities have had a lot more influence over how long schools will be open for, what the guardrails about them coming back to school will be, and they'll be drawing on general guidance from the central ministry. So there's a very wide range of archetypes in terms of how this works. But in general, if we go to the next page, effectively you need to have a set of different capabilities as part of this organization. You need to have people who are supporting on decision-making, strategy, policy, coordination, making sure that we think about what the scenarios are, how all these different components are coming together. You need to have a team that's thinking about data. You need to have people who are thinking about my external relations and my communication. We need to have people who are thinking about the operations, because reopening is not the same as just ordinary school reopening, which is a complicated enough job in itself, but will have additional components. And then we need to have people who are thinking about what needs to happen in the support function, so that my procurement organization is able to step up and not just procure textbooks, but procure PPE if that's what's needed for my teachers and for my students. And so this organization, this may sit nationally, this may sit regionally, there may be elements of it that sit at different levels, but these are definitely the capabilities that need to be in place at different levels across the system. And if we go to the next page, the benefits of having this as a single team rather than relying on my existing organizational capabilities to do this. I think the first is, this is a new challenge, and we actually need to have a very clear group of people who are focused on this as a dedicated team, or as potentially even changes to my structure, so that I'm actually able to have very, very clear and explicit decision authorities, roles and responsibilities. Having that dedicated team allows me to have a very disciplined operating model. So whether that is about daily meetings to review the data, make decisions, think about what's going to happen, a whole bunch of enabling tools around templates and agendas to make those meetings effective. And then finally, an increased level of agility. So by having a dedicated group of people who are thinking about all the components of this very, very complicated challenge of how do I get back to school, I can actually stay closer to the affected stakeholders. And I also have greater visibility of risks in one area that may make another area much more challenging. So I may be able to see, for instance, from the people working with the support functions that the operational side of things is going to be a challenge and be able to head some of those things off a little bit in advance. Now, we see this emerging in all sorts of places as a construct in systems that are responding to this crisis. I think there are also a couple of examples from other situations where we can potentially learn something from the government. So I think one crisis which we have actually been reflecting on a lot as a firm and also with some of the governments that we speak to, especially in West Africa, has been the experience of the Ebola crisis. Now that was obviously different. It was epidemiologically different. It was much more concentrated in a single region of the world. But I think there are some lessons there in how these different organizations were able to respond. So I think both Sierra Leone and Liberia set up special task forces which had the Ministry of Education in the lead, but also had development partners and NGOs and other organizations involved in the education value chain to get all of this done. And the organizational construct was able to think both about the health side of things, but also about the education side. You can see distance learning, teacher training, etc. And we're able to do the things which the ordinary system, whether it's rapid assessment of school buildings, thinking about were we meeting the health standards that we needed, to do all of that much more quickly and effectively than would have happened if we just left the regular ministry system to do or relied on ad hoc partnerships. Similarly, also in West Africa, but thinking about a slightly different kind of crisis, the Boko Haram insurgency, the Education and Emergencies Working Group trying to bring people together so that we actually have schools, the relevant government stakeholders, also the multilateral organizations and NGOs, and they're really with a focus on data collection. So to say, actually, my whole system at the moment is disrupted, but I still need data to make good decisions about what I'm going to do. And although the system is disrupted, I still have to provide materials, equipment, even more complicated equipment than I might potentially in other times. And this is a stressful time for my teachers and my heads, and how do I help them get through this emergency? So I think those are two quite different examples, but they are interesting in terms of broad range of stakeholders to focus on this question of what are the operational challenges, what's the data that I need, and how do I make sure that I get all these different people aligned for this very, very complicated challenge. I'm going to hand over now to Fred to talk about, now we've got this organizational infrastructure, what does it do? How do we actually use that team to approach the other dimensions of this response framework that we spoke about earlier?
Thank you, Stephen. So as you see on this page, the second element of you have a team, we believe is to set up clear, disciplined processes and decision-making processes across the entire organization to make sure that you are very rigorous and purposeful as to all the reopening should happen at all levels and across 3 horizons. So everybody right now is busy designing protocols for respect of safety rules and health rules across the system for the schools, which we believe that actually to deliver efficiently on the reopening, there is also a benefit of thinking not only about those health and safety rules, but about all the other elements you need to have in place to ensure a safe and effective reopening. And we think that thinking across 3 horizons actually helps make sure that you are covering all bases. First of all, there is the aspect of being ready to reopen, which covers, of course, the health and safety rules, the infrastructure readiness, the preparedness of the teaching and staff, but also the pedagogical aspect. As we move away from simply responding to the crisis to managing the reopening, we are also going to have in mind the pedagogical question and the learning question. And so there is also guidelines about how do you prepare from a pedagogical point of view to reopen. Or are your teachers preparing to adapt their teaching to a situation where students haven't come to school from anything from a few weeks to several months if you reopen only beginning of next year? Or do you also think about specific protocols to reach out to students, parents, and society to make sure that you have the willingness of all the actors to come back to school? We'll get back to it. Actually, it's one of the main difficulty right now is actually making sure that everybody is trusting in coming back to school in a safe way and that you're able to get them back to school. We'll get back to that in a minute. Then once you have decided on how to reopen and you are ready to reopen, how do you manage the reopening? It's not only about the timing and the phasing of the reopening, but it's also about is expected to do what. We have seen quite a few examples in which the guidelines are quite clear, but there is no clarity on who is going to do what at each level, and inside the school who is expected to do what. So being very clear for each of the protocols, the process you put in place about who is expecting to act, who is expecting to do what. And then finally, the question of the allocation of budget and material resource, we'll get to it. It is easy to say that schools should do this or that. It is a bit more difficult to ensure that they have the money to do it and the material to do it. One point on that topic, we heavily recommend trying to do some pilots or at least some simulations in a representative sample of schools before reopening. We've seen quite a few examples of measures being decided at the central level and then not working so well when they hit the ground. Either because they hadn't been taught by people who actually have on-the-ground experience, or because when actually you need to implement them in different type of schools than the one you tried it initially, they are not working so well. So really being purposeful about selecting a sample, going and trying to actually put this in place even before announcing it if you can afford it. And then once you have reopened, I think everybody right now has this high setup on the reopening. There is a question of making sure that you can stay reopened in a safe way and that you can actually start mending some of the problems in learning that might have emerged during the lockdown period. So first of all, there is a need of clear process to make sure that you're able to monitor, to make sure that the measures you have put in place are actually delivering on the safe return to school, and at the same time to have clear procedures about what to do and who should do it. Should there be a resurgence? Should there be cases coming up in school? On top of that, you also need to start thinking about the question of pedagogical aspects. How do you potentially take advantage of the situation to enforce some overall improvement in education system? How do you devise policy to adapt to the new normal? Actually, it's becoming more and more clear that for a relatively significant period of time, we might not go back to fully reopen schools for everybody all the time. We might have temporary closures. We might have only partial reopening. Some students coming back to school, some not. Students coming back only part of the day or part of the week. So right now we have many systems around the world getting ready to scale up blended learning at scale, either immediately or by the beginning of the next academic year. So as a general conclusion here, really being purposeful about being sure that you have clearly defined processes for each of those is one of the key elements on top of having a leadership team. Moving on to the next page is the question of data, which we discussed a little bit last time. I think most governments today would agree that they would be in a better place today if they had set up early warning mechanism and better monitoring from an epidemiological point of view to warn them early on of the spread of the virus. I think it would be quite sad if we end up in a situation in which we are forced to reclose the school because we have not set up this data collection mechanism and monitoring mechanism early enough and systematically enough at the whole school level. So we believe there are at least three types of data you should be following. First of all, there is the data about health and safety. They're both monitoring the compliance with the rules you set up at the central level, are the rules respected in school, and the outcomes. Are you actually managing to contain the spread of the virus? On top of those health and safety outcomes, which is what most people are thinking about, there are at least two elements which you should follow up. The first one is the re-enrollment uptake. If you look at the systems who are busy reopening, you actually have a lot of variety right now, but you have some systems right now who during the first week of reopening, they are only managing to bring something like half of the students back to school among the eligible population. And if you look at previous example, Stephen, you spoke about the example of Ebola crisis. We indeed see that in some countries at the time, there was a clear drop in enrollment, especially in developing countries after the initial crisis. And so there is a case to follow up on those measures quite closely, not only for students, but also for teachers. And finally, there is the aspect of academic performance and remediation. If we look at the current timeline for reopening, there are some school systems which will have gone with nearly half a year without schooling. So there will be most likely a big gap in learning that will have to be fixed. Measuring that is actually the first step to being able to address it and to make sure that you're able to monitor whether the measures that you are taking are appropriate. Coming back to the question of the nerve center, which we discussed previously, Uh, Clearly, this is a role for the Nerve Center here to play an active role into setting up the data collection mechanism, making sure you are creating the data dashboard, making sure you are making them available, analyzing the data, being able to react quickly at a granular level as soon as you notice that there is a problem, that the measure is not delivering an expected outcome, and also setting up recurring reporting mechanism to the broad public and to the different stakeholders. One question you might ask yourself, you have seen many governments setting up daily or at least very regular briefing to the general public about the overall epidemiological situation. Whether you want to do this for the school system is also a good question to be asked to make sure that you are able to create the trust into the efficiency of the measures that you are putting in place. Moving to the next page, we have taken the effort of showing a small example of what a school dashboard could look like. A few points here. There are many tools right now which would allow you to relatively quickly set up a dashboard and cascade it even down to the school level so that each school might have its dashboard. So this can be done in a few weeks today at a fraction of the cost and the effort that was there a few years ago. You can just look up those tools. They are relatively easy to find. Second element, if we look at the type of indicators that we have given as an example on the left, we usually consider it's good to have a mix of both process measures and outcome measures, both checking whether are the schools having the equipment they need? Are they actually respecting the rules? And then the outcomes, are you actually getting a limited number of new cases? Are you actually getting back students and teachers to school? Are you actually progressively closing the achievement gap that was created during the school closure? Maybe one last point in terms of academic performance. There is a case here to follow both not only the overall drop and the overall gap created on average for the whole student population, but also potentially the gap between the best students and the others, between the students with a high socioeconomic status as the others, as there is relatively clear evidence that the crisis is impacting differently different types of students. So to summarize here, really a plea for systematic data gathering, data sharing, and data analysis. Moving on here to a few examples, what we see right now are mostly examples which are not related with the school systems. The school systems are only reopening, but actually a lot of creativity around this crisis in terms of making use of the power of data to help decision making and both to help also citizens in their day-to-day behavior. If you look at the example, for example, of Singapore, inside the schools here, there is a deployment of an AI-driven automated temperature screening system. There is, of course, if you look at the right on the page, both in Singapore and in Denmark, track and tracing tools which are being put in place. Denmark has been using also weekly digital questionnaires. You could think about doing the same to monitor the situation in your schools. Is the implementation going well? Are the rules being respected? Norway has made also use of data tools to gather intelligence. I think there is a lot of stuff that can be done using the power of AI to inform decision making, to understand better the virus, to understand whether the measures you are putting in place are working. So that was about the use of data. Our next key condition for success might seem obvious. It's about communication, but I think we have seen quite a few countries who are trying to reopen right now, encountering some problems regarding to communication, especially with the need of creating trust and creating confidence in the public that the reopening is safe for all parties and is being done in a professional way. A few points maybe to underline here. First of all, there is no such thing as too much communication and too early communication when it comes to a crisis situation like the one we are going through. A second point is that they should not be only a one-size-fits-all communication. Your communication should be targeted to the different stakeholders. So it's quite important to think about all the potential stakeholders, the teachers, the parents, the students, the school principals, potentially third-party stakeholders which are involved in the education system, and tailoring your communication to them, and tailoring also the guidelines you are giving to each of them. There is also a case to think specifically about vulnerable segments of society which might not be reached through the same channel as other segments of society. In terms of how should the information be communicated, there is also a good case to be made about two-way communication. It's not only about informing, it's also about listening. We have seen quite a few examples of systems communicating guidelines quite early on, but then having limited ability to get feedback on those guidelines and only learning later on that there might be some adaptation needed. So we really encourage you to put in place two-way mechanism for communication. There is also an opportunity to leverage multiple channels of communication, both digital and physical. I'll get back to that in a minute. We've seen some creativity there. We also cannot underline enough the need for a single source of truth. So we have seen some example of communication with different guidelines coming from different authorities, be it between the central, the regional, or the school level, or be it between different sources of power. This is, of course, very detrimental to trust. So ensuring that you have a single source of truth where everybody can go and get the information is extremely important. And finally, in terms of what should be covered, it should not be only about what measures should be put in place. It should not be only about what you should do. It's also about reporting regularly about, indeed, these measures are working. We are reporting. We are very transparent about what are the outcomes in terms of new cases in schools. What are the outcomes in terms of the spread of the virus. And it's also not only about health and safety. It's also about pedagogical measures, making sure that you are clear about what is the implication for the assessment, what is the implication of what is expected to be covered in schools, what are potential recommendations on pedagogical methods that you are recommending to be put in place inside the schools. And finally, it should also be about communicating the tools and resources you are making available to help all the different actors. One last point on this page. We recommend, of course, to give adequate time between announcement and enforcement. Again, we have seen quite a few examples of system announcing measures and requesting actors to implement them too fast. There is a case to be made to wait a little bit and to make sure that everybody has the time to get ready. Moving on to the next page, a few good examples that we found looking around internationally in terms of measures that were put in place. Singapore, for example, has put in place a chatbot which allows people to get responses automated to their most common questions. They've put in place detailed guidelines and frequently asked questions for all levels of education, tailored to the different levels of education. They are making creative use of WhatsApp to communicate with their citizens. If you look at Denmark, they've also done clearly detailed handbooks of different measures segmented by each type of schools, each type of school level. And they've also put in place standardized mandatory instruction posters to be deployed in schools. There is quite a big benefit in doing that. First of all, it ensures that the rules are clearly communicated in the same way in all of the schools. And it also ensures that the quality of the communication is there. And also you are relieving the school from an additional work that they would have to do themselves. One other thing that Denmark has done that we think is quite good is communicating individually to parents, not only through the ministry, but also more individually to the school principals. I think it's different from receiving a broad letter sent to everybody, from receiving a letter from your school principal. There is also a case to be made here to provide your school principals with a few communication guidelines or maybe even a template that they can use. Finally, Denmark has also put in place a hotline to answer any question that people might have. Interesting point, they've made this hotline available in more than 20 languages. Again, something quite important. In some countries, you see right now that the virus is spreading much faster in migrant communities, making sure that you are able to communicate in their own language to communities which are not necessarily managing your local language is also important. You can see at the bottom another example from Dubai, which I will skip in the interest of time. Moving on to the next element. The next element is about making sure that you are coordinating well with all the actors. The COVID crisis is impacting different segments of societies and is requesting coordination between levels of powers and organizations which are not used to coordinate, or at least not so fast. So it is very important to make sure that you're coordinating quite well. Here also, we have already learned some lessons from early players. If I look at the government, we have seen indeed some situation where there was the opportunity for improvement in terms of coordination. The main new element here is the need to coordinate between the education system and the health departments. These are parts of the government which are not used to coordinate closely, at least not in all systems, and not in this type of situation. So thinking closely about how you are going to coordinate at all levels, both at the level of the government, but also the level of individual providers and actors at the local level in the health system, to make sure that what is happening in your school is well coordinated with what is happening in the health system is an important element. Another important element where we have also seen some issues is making sure that whatever is being given in terms of guidelines from the school system is extremely consistent with what is being given in terms of guidelines by local authorities, when local authorities are not directly in charge of education. So we have seen a few examples of diversion guidelines given by local municipalities, local authorities, versus what was given by the school system. And of course, it's not helping into creating trust and helping the local actors implementing the reopening in a safe and effective way. Of course, there is a need to coordinate inside the education sector. Maybe here the main point is to make sure that you are not coordinating only with a small sample of schools, but you are making sure to take into account all the specificities of all the service providers. So there are many differences between levels of education, between type of educations, and we have seen quite a few examples of rules which are applying quite well, for example, in a general track for secondary education, which are not working so well, for example, for a vocational track or for a private provider versus a public provider. So making sure that you are tailoring your coordination to include all the different types of providers is an important element. And then one additional element is the connection with third parties, which is particularly important in developing countries. One of the key lessons that was learned during the Ebola crisis was actually a very effective response in many countries that was coordinated between donors and agencies and local countries, which was quite efficient, for example, to help students get back to schools who actually had dropped out. There is clearly a case to again ensure that in this situation, the action of the different agencies, NGOs is well coordinated with that of the government to ensure maximum impact. Finally, this goes without saying, there is a need to coordinate with the media and with society as a whole to make sure that everybody is aligned with the recommendations. If we look at the next page, finally, there is a role for supporting functions. Supporting schools reopening, at least on the 4 dimensions. The first dimension is operations, in which you need to be thinking of at least 2 things. First of all, make sure that schools have access to sufficient health and safety equipment. This will depend on the local market conditions. So right now you are seeing some school systems where a school seems to be able to get themselves access to the private market, to the resources they need. In some other systems, it's not the case yet, and there is a case to coordinate at the central level. We'll see an example about that in a minute. And then secondly, the question of school operations. The reopening is a big change for many schools, both in terms of transport, in terms of infrastructure, thinking about how you are able to help your school reorganize, provide them guidance, provide them with additional support is one important element. The second element is about information technology, where again, there are 2 tracks you might be thinking of. First of all, there is specific tools linked to the situation in which we are in from a health point of view, from a tracking point of view, from a coordination of the entire effort. We have seen a few of those previously. And secondly, there is an entire track around blended learning. As I said before, there is a good chance that we will not get back to normal for the coming months and maybe for the coming years immediately. Many systems right now are thinking about already in the process of scaling up massively blended learning. This requires support both in terms of hardware and in terms of software. Thirdly, in terms of finance and budgeting, there is, of course, an impact of the crisis. It will be usually heterogeneous depending on the type of school and of your system. Nonetheless, all schools will face an impact on their cost to be able to afford the new measures, and some of the schools will also have a major impact on revenue. we believe there is a case to get started quite quickly in making sure that you are mapping relatively granularly what will be the impact on the different type of schools, and making sure that you are designing an action plan for all of these elements for all of the different schools. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is the aspect of capability building. The new situation is requiring new behavior from everybody in the systems: school principals, teachers, parents, students. There is clearly a case for a massive effort on that side to make sure that you are building capability quite quickly, to make sure that not only people are able and know how to act, but they are also aware of the importance of acting in new ways. And this is not only about health and safety, as you can see at the bottom left of the page, it's also about potentially providing training on how to deal with the mental health consequences of the crisis, and also how to potentially train at scale both teachers and parents and students about how to use remote learning tools. We have seen examples of systems planning to train the entire teaching population in a few weeks and months to be able to scale up a blended learning this year or at the beginning of the next school year. Again, moving on the next page on a few examples. On terms of procurement, we have seen example of Taipei, for example, coordinating a command center to make sure that at a centralized level they are able to allocate in the most efficient way the needed equipment to all of the schools. Again, that might not be needed 4 months from now as the private sector is progressively responding and the products are becoming available. Still, if you look right now at the situation of masks, in most countries it are still not readily available, and so there is potentially a role to be played there by the government. If we look at infrastructure, taking an example here from Singapore again, is there a role at the central or regional level to help, for example, the needed adaptation in transportation, and how do you adapt the whole school bus operations to the new situation, or do you potentially provide additional financial support to make sure that they continue running? When it comes to technology support and training, China has been quite active into making sure that there is a quick move to blended learning and digital learning, both by providing free access to digital resources and also by enabling and quickly approving tech companies to provide online teaching services. Also an example there which other countries are either thinking of already implementing, of making sure that you are partnering with telecom providers to ensure that students can have access to the digital learning resources. Finally, in terms of financing and funding, here an example from Germany, where you see a first example of immediate funding program to support the use of digital learning solutions quite massively across schools. So last element about making sure that you are actually providing sufficient support to the schools and adapting your support function to support school reopening. Closing in on this presentation on the next page, just we wanted to leave you with 3 thoughts. First of all, I think as we already discussed at our last webinar, you can see on the page that the schedule for reopening over the coming weeks and over the past weeks is quite busy, with different countries reopening with different rules, reopening at different level of ambition, reopening at different speed. We will learn a lot in the coming weeks about the efficiency of different measures. We will learn a lot about the virus in the coming weeks. So there is a huge benefit of staying connected with the news on this topic from different countries and making sure that you are learning the lessons of other countries as they progressively reopen. And 2 additional main lessons which are underlying the presentation today. First of all, the need to be well organized and very systematic with a dedicated team, with clear mandate and responsibility, with clear processes. That's one. And secondly, making sure that you put in place 6 guiding principles, systematic decision at the central and middle layer level. Make sure that you are gathering data. Make sure that you communicate often. There is never too much communication. Liaise well and coordinate with partners, and make sure you scale up your support operations on the ground. And finally, ensure compliance with the new rules and process. That being said, I propose we close the presentation right now and move to a small Q&A. To introduce the Q&A on the next page, we were proposing to start with a small survey with all of you, which should pop up to the right of your screen, with the following question. How confident are you in your organization ability to have the resources and readiness to reopen in your country or in your school system? So you can respond on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being quite uncertain, to 7 being extremely confident in the ability of your school system to reopen safely and effectively.
And while you're filling in the poll, we had a bunch of different questions coming in. Several of them were technical, so why don't I address those while we're filling in the poll, and then I will pose Fred and Stephen some more of the content questions when the poll has been released. So I did have several more people asking if we can have the deck. The way to get that is to wait until after the presentation. We'll be sending you an email. Even if you leave early, we'll still send you that email, so don't worry. We'll send you an email with instructions on how to get the deck. So please don't put your email address in the Q&A. We won't be able to pull all of those, but just keep an eye out for us, and we'll be sending an email with instructions on how to receive the deck. So what's interesting here is I think it looks almost like a normal curve, in that there's a huge range of certainty in the confidence of the organization and resources for reopening. And most people are sitting in the middle of that range, but more on the uncertain side, and almost no one is extremely or very confident. And I think that reflects the early stages of reopening. We just go up back to the page where we show the countries that have reopened. There are quite a few flags on there, but there's also another 170 flags that aren't there yet, and so we still are in the early stages of reopening. So I'd love to encourage you now to write questions in the Q&A. I see a lot coming in already. First question I'd like to pose to our panelists. What obstacles and pitfalls have systems encountered as they reopen? And how can we avoid these with specific examples and case studies, if possible?
I think, well, we have talked to a few of those, and we've built a presentation on actually avoiding those pitfalls. If I look at those that we have seen the most, for some countries, we have seen lack of systematic decision making. There are some countries who have been willing to take a decision very fast, and we have announced measures which were not really grounded in sufficient evidence or consultation. So that's one example. The second one is on the communication, being very purposeful. We spoke about that. I think we cannot underscore that enough. Being very mindful about communication, being very mindful about doing it very often is the second one. The third element is linked to communication, is heavy consultation before announcing anything and taking decision. The main pitfall that we've seen is some like protocols going out and them not being realistic. And then, of course, a lot of criticism going on in the press, a lot of criticism from some stakeholders who were not consulted. That's the third one. The fourth one is, I said, the piloting and the testing. Again, we have seen a few situations in which you see a protocol and then in the school it doesn't work so well, and then you need to go back on it. Of course, this will happen because we will all learn as we do, but some of them could have been avoided by proper piloting. The fifth element probably is going a bit too fast and wanting to go too fast. So making sure that you leave enough time. At the same time, there is a balance to be found, of course, between leaving enough time and making sure that you reopen as fast as possible to ensure continuity of learning. And the fifth one, which goes really badly, is when you don't provide enough equipment. Actually, most countries at the moment, they seem to have learned lessons from the health situation initially with the healthcare providers. But of course, as soon as you have a lack of sufficient equipment, even in a single school, this is front-page news, and this is creating a lack of mistrust. And finally, the seventh point, which is probably the most difficult, is making sure that you have the trust of the different, of the parents, of the students, of the teacher. Probably the most tricky point. There is no bullet answer to make that work. It's a combination of all what we discussed before. But if there's one thing you need to get right, is create that trust on the safety of reopening the school.
Now, there's a second question around the archetypes that we presented on our last webinar, and whether we had any further thoughts on those or systems that had implemented those particularly successfully. And so just to give a little recap for those of you who weren't on the previous webinar, we talked about several different archetypes for thinking about returning to school in terms of the for whom, which students return. One was opening for primary school early or first, and having secondary school open later. Another was opening for transitional grades first, so grades transitioning to the next level, graduation years. Another was opening for vulnerable students first, and we gave them the example of Israel or the UK, where students with a social worker or with special needs came back into the system first, or opening part-time for all students in some kind of blended format where students were alternating being at school. And so we had, I think, 3 or 4 different people asking, do we, as we're now a couple of weeks later, have we seen other systems putting in place any of those models? Fred, do you have any thoughts on those archetypes? Or actually, Stephen, maybe I can hear you. Go ahead if you can try.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Go ahead, Stephen.
So I think it depends a little bit on the different priorities that the system sets. And so there's one archetype where you say ultimately the most important thing is the kids who are going to be graduating. So actually I want to have the kids who are closest to a transition point, whether that is 16, 17, 18, or whether it's those transitioning primary to secondary. Those are the kids I need to have in school, because those are the ones, the rest, everybody else I can catch up later. And that's one archetype, and I think that's one thing which a couple of countries in Europe have taken as an approach. I think there's an alternative, which is to say, actually, ultimately the thing that we are, as a country, not as an education system, are prioritizing is how do we enable people to get back to work. And in that context, what you would think about is saying, I actually want to have the youngest kids back in the classroom, because the older kids can cope with distance learning and are more likely to be able to learn independently. But I want to have the younger kids back, also because the older kids are more independent. That enables parents to go back to work. And then I think there are other, but then there are other considerations around that, around public health. So I can probably rely on older kids to a greater extent to follow physical distancing rules than I can with the youngest age groups. So I think there's a mix of those things. I think some countries are still debating this. Some countries have made the definite choice to go either with those the older age group or the younger age group. I think related to this, actually, there's also an important equity consideration. I saw that come up a couple of times in the chat box for questions. The other thing I need to think about is maybe I don't do this by age group. Maybe I think about which schools I reopen, because which kids are likely to be falling furthest behind in the absence of remote learning options. So this is something which some systems did as they shut down, to say, actually, we want to have kids who are in care or in preschool meals are those who are going to be able to continue to come to school. Or even as we look ahead to say, actually, if we had some sense of which groups of kids were not benefiting and not learning, then we might be able to prioritize a little bit of how we reopen around that, especially if there's limited physical capacity and restrictions been put in place from a health standpoint. So I think again, this is probably an example of a decision which most people have taken. It flows from other decisions about what their overall priority is. But I think it is so enmeshed with the public health side and with the equity side of the learning, regaining learning and remediation, that these things need to come together, which is why these decisions need to be made in a much more integrated way than we've seen some systems been able to do so far.
Thank you, Stephen. Just to add a couple of specific examples from some of the conversations we've been having, I think it's important to recognize too that this is a journey, and so it's not like your end point is just opening for primary. It's that maybe that's what you do first. And so just a couple of examples. In Norway, for example, they started off with lower level schools on the 27th of April, but all schools opened on the 11th of May. But the lower level schools, grades 1 to 4, have full-time presence at schools because of the child care imperative, and also, frankly, because remote learning isn't working as well for that age group. And the older students come every second day or half the day, depending on the school. I think also if you look at France, there's a similar situation where schools, kindergartens and elementary schools reopened last week. And then middle schools are starting opening on the 18th of May, that was yesterday, with those transitional classes. and that high schools will maybe open towards the end of May. And so there's often a transition as schools reopen to start with the areas where they believe that there's the most need.
And maybe
so I think
one last element on that, Emma, maybe just discussion in the last few weeks that I've seen at least. I think the more and more, there is no way we can on the long term afford to have one part of the student that is not coming to school whatsoever. And so the more and more the discussion are revolving around, okay, we can reopen starting by this or this and this progressively by this, but that's going to be anyway a matter of a few weeks or a few months at most. The question is, how do we get all students at least in one shape or form back to school relatively quickly? Because at least from an equity point of view, from a political point of view, from a pedagogical point of view, at least the conversation I've been having, it is more and more difficult, except for the higher education level, to justify not having at least some form of real link for all the students with the school. And so I expect the conversation to move more and more into that direction. How are we able to afford having all the kids back to school? Depending on what we learn about the virus in the coming weeks, which will be determined in 6 weeks, either we'll kind of see everybody going back to school massively in September, or we will actually confirm what most people are thinking, which is we cannot just do that right now. And we'll have most students indeed in a model like the one that Emma is pointing at, probably with maybe full-time for the lower levels and part-time for everybody else.
Thank you, Fred. So I am aware we are at time. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A still. I also see a lot of questions around how are schools really thinking about this blend of remote and in-person learning. I don't think we're going to have time to answer that today, but we are going to have more webinars coming up. And this is one of the questions that we're seeing a lot of systems ask, because everyone's going to have to be thinking about this. And I don't think that anyone has fully cracked it yet. So stay tuned. This is not the last of our webinar series. And just thank you again for your time and for all of your commitment in ensuring the continuity of education for students while they're out of school, and then making sure that they are safe once they return. Have a good day, everybody, and thank you again.